to get connected. See, Matthias got back. You want to jump in?
You are mute, Matthias, I think.
I am. Thank you. Different setting here. Okay. So yeah, I got the recording permission. So this breakout room is going to record it. I'm gonna coordinate with Felix later how to upload this. Okay, so I guess I'm late, but we are talking about the open source developer ecosystem challenge. I'm particularly here because there's also a developer ecosystem challenge. And I think I would like to talk about whether we should have one or two challenges. I have some thoughts on my own there. I've looked at some data from previous funds and how things are going right now in this fund. And I also have some input from the Cardano Foundation, as I'm the representative for the foundation in the Catalyst Circle. So I would like, if that's appropriate, to have a brief discussion on this, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, definitely. Those were also, I think, one of the main reasons is because there's different efforts going on in this direction, and to provide a chance to get together. Really happy to see you're here. George is here, who jumped in as well. Patrick is here, who's also proposing open source challenges and on the current challenge team for the one that's already in there. So it looks like we got a good group. So I thought I'll just start with giving a little bit of a context. So we're all starting from sort of a similar point. So we're talking about the challenges in Catalyst that are there each round. And so originally there was the challenges that were defined by the Catalyst team that comprised of the majority of the budget. And they entered every time a development ecosystem challenge. And this was always the biggest one. And I went back and couldn't find all the exact numbers, but for Fund 5 and Fund 6, this was about 25% of the total budget. So it's quite substantial. And so from Fund 6 to Fund 7, there was sort of a transition of all the majority of the budget for the challenges to the community through the challenge settings. And so the Catalyst team did propose the development ecosystem for 2 million for Fund 7 last round, but it didn't get voted in. It got pretty high, but it was pretty big, so it got skipped. There wasn't enough money left over by the time we got there. And so there was the open source developer ecosystem, which I proposed together with Juliana, which was much smaller, and it was luckily right below it. So this one did get funded. So we have that one in, but now that it's in, it's pretty clear that it's too small for the kind of efforts that people want to do within the open source ecosystem. And so now there are several people who noticed this and are all thinking like, hey, we need to bring this idea back of a bigger development ecosystem challenge. So today, hoping to align exactly on that. So I put up a Miro board, and I think at some point I would like to try out a little bit of voting on three main questions, which is what should be the total budget for open source development in the challenges? Should there be one or two or maybe even three of these challenges? And I thought first of two, and what should then be the distribution between those two? So maybe we keep it at two for now. To get some input from everybody, and then to see, and I set up a little bit of a board where we can maybe see who in this group wants to participate in making this happen and aligning on all of that. So that was it for introduction. I see Patrick has his hand up, and if anybody wants to add something also before we dive in, feel free to add your hand as well. Patrick, floor is yours.
I would like to understand the difference between the developer ecosystem and the open source developer ecosystem and the open source ecosystem. In one case, we focus on the developer experience. In the second one, of the open source developer ecosystem. And the third one, of the open source experience. Both the three point of views, they have three titles, not because, maybe they are really three different ideas, but all of these three, they kind of need something in common. If we can identify what is in common, then it's easy to to share, to unify under a single proposal. My understanding is that, tell me if I'm wrong, please. We need common tools, processes, and a set of rules, maybe I'm wrong, that allow everybody to participate with equal chances of success. Maybe you could, I don't know, tell me what do you think when we talk about the developer ecosystem, or what do you think when we talk about the open source developer or open source ecosystem? We were talking, Sophie and I, we were talking about merging the proposal, because the open source developer and the open source ecosystem, they tend to be pretty similar. So we wanted to understand what are the common points. And then I have another question for you, Matthias, because I know that you're kind of a contact point with the foundation. And we won't move a step without the foundation. And yesterday was Tuesday, yes. And also the previous Tuesday, I had contact with the vice president of the Eclipse Foundation. And because I really wanted to tell them, hey, you know, Cardano is doing this. Why don't you propose your experience to help? And he told me, for sure, we have people in their open source ecosystem that are able to make proposals. And this is one of the things that would be nice. But the other thing is, I really wanted this person to get in touch with the Cardano Foundation, because maybe one foundation can provide services to the other, and maybe this one foundation has already solved problems that the other foundation hasn't. Yeah, that were my 2 points. So let's try to understand which are the similarities of the ideas, what we expect when we talk about developer ecosystem, open source ecosystem, and the other is how to get in touch with the foundation. Because many things that are related around open source, they will end up knocking at the door of the foundation. And if there is a closed door, then it won't be possible to proceed. I have a concrete example, but that's it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot. I'll try to be concise, and maybe some of the questions that you have regarding the foundation we can take offline. But the foundation are, of course, the usual channels, email, LinkedIn. If it's specific people, everyone at the foundation is super busy, but definitely reach out and also remind them. It's like, hey, there's an opportunity. I mean, Catalyst is open, right? Everyone can participate once you get your idea scale account in and whatnot, right? So don't ask for permissions, just do it. That's kind of my answer to that. I cannot speak intelligently about the difference or the commonalities between the open source developer ecosystem and the open source challenge. But I do want to point out some observations that I made between the question regarding open source developer ecosystem versus developer ecosystem. If we look at Fund 6, for example, for the developer ecosystem challenge, right? Granted, it was a number of $1,005,000 worth in ADA. There were initially 121 proposals and 102 made it to the governance phase, right? If we look at now the open source developer ecosystem in Fund 7, all stages, we only had 39 proposals. So 121 was 39, right? So it's a significant reduction. And right now there's 38 in refinement stage. We don't know how many will end up. And of course, I assume one reason for that is it's just a lot less funding, right? Still, $200,000 is not too bad. Like a chunk of that, there are still tools that you can build, right? But I think that is it's important to point out, because ultimately, yes, we definitely want to open source projects, which is also, in the interest of the foundation, for example, right? Because everything that lands on mainnet, everything that makes transactions, if there are more transactions on mainnet, the Cardano Foundation, that's in their interest. It's everyone's interest, really. What I see limiting, though, is that, and I'm an open source believer myself. I've been an open source advocate since the mid-90s, since I first started using Linux. What I'm worried about is that, and James has a few opinions about that as well. I think a lot of people still do not know what the hell they are doing when it comes to Cardano. And they don't want to put everything up in the open, right? And of course, I can only talk about myself here. I definitely fall into the category as well. I'm pretty comfortable with, sharing my failures, but there was some learning that I had to do. And I still do not feel comfortable to do that when it comes to, well, now I'm a for-profit corporation, and we need those players for adoptions as well. So I think just having an open source developer ecosystem, while I truly want to support this, and with a much higher budget, I think at this point, there are many players in the game that would not feel comfortable adhering to the rules that such a challenge imposes on them. On the other hand, that's the approach that we took with Blaze.io, which did not get funded. We were a little bit maybe too realistic in the funds that we needed for it. But essentially what we said there is like, okay, well, it's going to be developed. It's going to be closed source initially. And there's an open source model. As soon as we actually have a launch using that marketplace creator, then it's going to be open source. There are some licenses that is quite frankly hard to impose. I mean, I know this is recorded, and I'm not saying this is a matter of fact, but there are people that claim that Amazon, for example, took a bunch of open source projects and turned it against the license agreements into profitable solutions on their own, right? I'm not saying that's true, but you see a lot in that. Really making money through open source is hard as hell. And we already have so many problems in the Cardano ecosystem. Of course, there's many things that go right, but I would be in favor of actually having both. Have an open source developer ecosystem that's clear, got to develop in the open, have open source license agreement. Doesn't mean that you cannot make money using it, but at least, the source code is open, and potentially that also maybe shifts into now the open source challenge, right? Like about processes. So that's great, a great conversation to have, but I believe we still, at this point in time, we need a developer ecosystem challenge on its own, where people can say, yeah, I'm open the source code when I'm ready, or not at all. So that's my 2 cents. 2 Lovelaces, sorry.
May I add, I mean, I understand. I would like to add that having an open source ecosystem does not force the projects to disclose their source code. What it should be is like a way for the new joiners, okay, new contributors, people that are interested in taking a look at the projects. You write what you want of your project. You should choose which is your level of discoverability. And the fact is, if you want your project to succeed, somehow it has to be visible. If you have this, like the idea of the next millennium, in my mind, you won't have this idea on your own. It is going to be a collective effort, and somehow to be discovered by others, at least you need to disclose a little bit, like a description. And also you need to allow some people to join your pool, to join forces with you, according to some descriptions. And description for me is technology. I make you an example. I see your super cool project is about decentralized identity, and the technology is, I don't know, some technology that I know, Java, and I know that I'm going also to learn a lot about blockchain. I would immediately come to knock to your door and say, hey, can I do something? Can I write documentation so at least I learn what's the architecture, blah, blah. And, but when I do learn, then I also tell my circle of people about your idea. And I think in this way, it won't happen the Amazon effect, that somebody will take your code and reuse. Because the idea behind open source is the proposer, the one that has the idea, and the co-creators. They form a group, a cohesive group that is able to develop and bring to life the idea. This is what I saw. That's step number one. And the most important thing is like how to contribute. I mean, I'm really, I'm still in the same point since 2012. The first time I did my first open source contribution, the most important thing was how to contribute. How can I contribute? Because really out there are a number of people, they want to learn. They want to learn how your system works. They want to learn the internals. They want to break your train and build their own. Take your idea in from a certain point of view. But you know, they are playing with your train in the end. You can get suggestions. And it's your decision to choose which part of your core business you want to share. What I saw, according to my experience at Eclipse, is typically there are working groups where the people are sharing technologies. Let me make an example. Automotive and aerospace, they share efforts by contributing to a modeling working group in which they developed tools for modeling software systems, for graphical modeling, for generating some output. And these tools are used initially were used in aerospace, automotive, and now are used in banking and other stuff to generate processes, all that stuff. So I think an open source ecosystem would be a push for new ideas, because some people, they can think, I'm not an academic. If I see something that I can, I don't know, a how-to that I can follow, based on that how-to, I know how to move the next step. Maybe I connect ideas in my mind in a practical fashion. And that, I think that's why it's important open source and hands-on learning.
If I may, I think another thing is that like fundamental tools that the network should have are not there yet, like all the tools. Like IOHK is building a network of tools, but that's not the complete possibility of tools that are possible on the network. So a good way of increasing those tools is by encouraging open source tools that further developer teams can use to build new stuff. An example, well, I want to start an open source project and I want to build tools that create markets in a more efficient way than currently is done. In my idea, the current markets that arise on the Cardano network are inefficient in the sense that they are all in this, they all are inefficient like costs. Like Cardano uses the UTXO model in which you can make transactions and you can consume UTXOs and you can witness them with different signing keys. So a transaction doesn't need to be composed on chain via smart contracts, say with a bid and an ask, like a lot of marketplaces do right now, because this imposes a lot of transaction cost and also bloats the network by creating more transactions. So my idea is to, well, create a tool that can create transactions just how you do on the client with just CBOR transactions, and create markets in that way and create it in an open source way so that other projects can use that tool to create transactions on their own network. So if I have a gaming project and I want to create a marketplace for my project that is on my website, you can just use that tool. And this is an example of a tool that is fundamental for the growth of the network, because other projects need tools like this. And currently it is not here. And people are relying on, well, other projects to create marketplaces that are hardly integrated into their project. So yeah, that's an example of why we need this.
Yeah, good points. I'm gonna give the turn to Roberto, who's had his hand up for a while.
Thanks. First of all, thank you all. I'm grateful to be in this room deciding or trying to decide how to make this work. I fully agree with Patrick. Our ideas are not even our ideas. It's just fruit of sharing knowledge, and that's a duty that we as humans, in my humble opinion, need to carry on and making awareness about it. And you know, I propose in Fund2 to develop my open source project, expecting that we could do it within Cardano ecosystem in a new way. Like, okay, I don't need to feel threatened because if we build a proper system, things like the one that happened with OpenSSL in the past won't happen again. We can fund projects, make those projects, allow those projects to allow people to build projects that transact on Cardano and generate traffic that indirectly fits this open source project. And it's fine if anyone's tried to do AWS. In fact, we are all winning if someone builds something like AWS on top of this open source tooling, because indirectly they are creating more traffic in the network, and you know, it comes to the treasury and we can go on funding those. So yeah, that's my thinking, and I think maybe in the future we will distinguish between like pure baseline projects that need to be taken care of, you know, educational stuff that, as Patrick said, how to contribute, how to use these tools, that's probably the most important part with along with the code, because yeah, open source is cool that we have code that we can try, study, try and understand it, and so we can build things. Open knowledge is like one layer below that, it's even more important, and that includes documentation. So yeah, I think that's how I was expecting the developer ecosystem to evolve in Cardano, like, you know, fearless way to develop open source software, because you don't need to, you know, protect your project too much. I mean, I'm an open source advocate and also a freedom advocate. So I'm more in the side of the free libre open source software and knowledge. You know, that's knowledge that we need to hand over to next generations, and they are free to build whatever they want with them. That's their problem, not mine. Yeah, those are my two love places to thanks all.
Thanks, Roberto. Yeah, I'll jump in there myself as well too, because I do sort of align with some of the thoughts that you shared, Matthias, and I've seen those struggles as well from, you know, just because the intention is there, it doesn't mean you can always just go open source right away, or even just making your code open source, that doesn't necessarily create an open source ecosystem. That is just, you know, oh, okay, now it's visible, but if you're not guiding people to come on board, taking steps, and that's actually a really difficult part. So that's not even necessarily so valuable, I think, to force every project, you must do open source or no go. I'd much rather see a project proposed in something like this closed source with an intended roadmap to include the community and a call to action to people to come and join them, right? So it's maybe also looking for the right language. Maybe open source development ecosystem is too on the nose or too focused on that. But I also, related to the development ecosystem that was originally there, felt that when I read the description, I had the idea that it should have been a bit more open sourcey, as in there was like a KPI about how much is the GitHub used by other projects. Well, that can only be done if it's open source, right? It's implicitly there, but I felt it wasn't getting enough attention in the assessments, those kind of KPIs. And when then I agree that those other projects should also get a chance, but I do, it's maybe a personal feeling that the projects who are actually daring to go all out open source should end up on the top of those ratings, right? Due to all the criteria that they should meet. And maybe it's more, but if those are getting skipped out in favor of projects that are just purely for profit, then I think that the challenge is kind of failing to capture on some real value in the community. And if people who are actually doing that, you know, the hardest efforts are getting discouraged because of that, it would be a real shame. But maybe it's about looking for the right language, where maybe it should be the collaborative development ecosystem, or something like that. And the language really focuses on those things, not just proposing projects that are open source, but setting up open source project management or organization, decentralized open source organization, mentoring projects, writing documentations. Like Patrick also focuses on these things like open standards. It's super important if we want all these different tools to interoperate. We need open standards more than anything, right? And that's very important in any of these kind of ecosystems. How are they all going to communicate with each other? Yeah, so for me, the initial thought was to create a challenge that mostly has more focus on those things, more emphasis on it, but that doesn't necessarily exclude projects from people who have who want to contribute to the open source ecosystem, but are maybe not ready or are still looking for the right moment or way to do that. Yeah, and I see a lot of hands up, so we'll just continue
Yes.
for a bit. I do hope to get to some of that voting on those
Definitely.
those ideas of the budget at some point. But
Definitely.
we'll do
I think
Thomas,
it's
James, and
Thomas, James.
Matthias.
Yep.
All right. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, Thomas,
Oh,
go
yeah,
for it.
sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to add that I think it's also inevitable that things will be open source. Like if someone creates a good tool, but it's closed source and someone thinks like, yeah, I can do it better and cheaper. Like someone will do it. It's inevitable. Because there will be struggles with the closed source software and those struggles will not be resolved if it stays closed source, or at least there needs to be a big push for those things. So I think it's inevitable that some fundamental tools will be open source. You see it with Blockfrost, for example. So that's good. I had another thing to say, but I'll come back to that later.
I'm trying to figure out if, like, what we can say about what's different now, right? Like, has open source development changed, or must it change necessarily in this new environment with these new tools we're now building with? I don't know, but if there was some claim we could make, I think that would be compelling, and it might help us figure out how many distinct proposals there need to be. And Thomas, thanks for mentioning Blockfrost, right? Like, we don't know why they're not open source yet, but the most generous, and yeah, now they have a high profile proposal for becoming open source, right? But that really speaks to something, because if we give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe it is just that they don't have the capacity to do the work of documenting things so that it can be sufficiently open source, right? And so that's the part that really resonates to me, is we want to move the conversation towards what Patrick is saying about giving people access points, to what Sosha pointed out about like building it, thinking of it as an ecosystem. And it's not just about saying my code is open. That's not the same thing as being open source. And nobody, I guarantee none of us in this room right now have the capacity to document stuff sufficiently to get them to that point, right? Like we've written some code that anybody can look at, but judging by the number of strangers who have submitted merge requests to us, zero, right? Barely any, So are we open source or not, So I'd be really interested in maybe a challenge that maybe it's like, hey, bring your project and make a proposal for getting documenters on it. Maybe QA DAO is already doing it. I don't know. So I don't know if those thoughts are helpful, but it's just, it's good to have a place to say them.
It is always good to hear your talk. And by the way, it's not entirely true. Gimbal Labs has that PPPL learning repo that has pull requests that got merged in. So, talking
Little by little.
About that, how can I reach that repo that I'm searching since? Because when I go to the Gimbal Labs website, I really try to find the content where I can, do some stuff. But going back to
we have a much better version of the website coming out, maybe as early as Friday and no later than next week. So yeah, thanks for your patience with that.
We really need it, because we are trying to build something for a proposal. I
Only
raised
about
my
6 months overdue.
I'm not cheating unless Thomas raised the hand before me. And I was saying that Gimbal Labs would be a perfect place to really tutor people into a topic. Of course, I guess there will be multiple streams, multiple topics. And in the open source ecosystem I lived, in the past, which I still admire, Eclipse. There are a number of people, they built their own enterprise. First they experience, then their own enterprise, they build their businesses by learning open source stuff, making the other learn. And you cannot imagine how much money you can make and in which holidays places you can go just for teaching people some stuff. But it's not about money. It's about letting the other learn. That's the step number one. So first, there will be companies at a certain point coming to you and ask, hey, can you make a training for these people? And you say, yeah, okay. It's $500 per person. Or if it's only you, it's 1,000 a day, of course, because training requires preparation. But the point of writing documentation is something that I was taught, either you write documentation during the project or you never write it. That is what my professor was saying. I have a different opinion. It's either you write documentation during the project or you find somebody that is so curious that is willing to learn and as exchange is willing to write documentation, which is me, basically, and many other people. So I try to get into some of the IO repository. And okay, first, how do you say scoglio? First iceberg goes, Haskell. Okay, go back, learn a little bit of Haskell. Let's hope it's enough to understand. And what would be really useful is like a person that put himself in the mind of a new joiner and tries to explain how to start doing something meaningful. And something meaningful typically means you build, which is not really interesting, unless it's something like system level C++ project, but basically running some example in which you see the use case, at least a base use case. At this point is the project or the company behind the project, the group of people behind the project that has to choose which is my core business. What can I open source such that a new joiner is directed in this piece that I'm open sourcing and this other repository, the business intelligence one, is our property. And this is, I think, the way that is most successful for the open source. Many companies, they did it this way. They identified what they can open source, and once it was clear, the part that can be open sourced, it was they really took, I don't know, an architect and asked, hey, document it. And then they took a newbie and they asked him, okay, now go through this README. Can you make it work? No. Where is the problem? Let's fix it. And this is what I can see, for instance, in Visual Studio Code or in Eclipse or in many other open source projects. This is what I would like to have. I would like to go, especially to the things that are fundamental, something that is going to run for everybody, that has no really specific business value for the company or group of people that is putting this out. I would like to be able to go to this GitHub repository, make it work, and play with this. And the risk that somebody is going to steal your work, it's always there. But you will be faster than them, because you now know that you have pressure behind you. You won't postpone.
All right, I'm gonna jump in there. So we have Thomas, then Matthias, and then George is also putting his hand up, but the time.
I was actually interrupted. If I may just share my thought real quick. if that's fine. Patrick jumped in.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, I'll be really quick, right? So first of all, I mean, Gimbal Labs does important open source work in that they're documenting, right, the whole experience. We know it's not great. IoT gives us what they can right now, supposedly, right? But you know, even the PPPL, the PPP is totally outdated, right? And that's something that we struggle with PPPL. So with that being said, because Prism was mentioned in there, Prism is not open source. Prism is an IoG product. It's service that they're offering with specific deals. And the plan is, of course, to have an open source SDK, but I actually don't know what it'll cost, right? In all the previous proposals for Italo Prism, there was not one single proposal that reserved some money for actually issuing the DIDs, because we didn't know, right? What would it cost? People were probably assuming, oh, everything is going to be open source. It's going to be free, as free for not cost anything, right? So IoG, IOHK, they still do proprietary work. They work on other blockchains other than Cardano as well. Is that still net positive? Probably, and here's why. About 20% of all transaction fees go back into the treasury. So if we have one giant corporation that is preferably not evil, having a closed source project utilizing Cardano, right? The transactions are on the blockchain. If you can't read them, oh, okay, well, it's not really open, it's not really useful, but they're there, right? I would argue most likely that's a better outcome than if they weren't part of the ecosystem. So still acknowledging that, I think the tendency here is that we want to move towards open source. So in terms of how do we budget this? I propose, because we want to go to the mirror board, I propose the open source dev ecosystem, say we request 2 million for that. And then we have a separate closed source or just a developer ecosystem challenge that's funded with 1 million. That way, we encourage participation in the open source ecosystem while still giving plenty of room for developers that are not yet comfortable open sourcing things. And still find collaboration. I mean, that happens all the time. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say before we hopefully go into the mirror board soon.
Yeah, so I guess, oh, sorry, Thomas, yeah, you were.
Thomas was
Yeah, I
yeah,
just
yeah.
want to add something that the fine line is between usability. Like BlockFrost is a really useful tool, and that's why they open source it. And like it's good to have closed source software. It drives innovation because there needs to be money made to have innovation. That's the incentive, so that's good. But I hope that in the future all the useful tools will be open source. So I think the usability that lies where we should focus. Like, is it something that brings value to other developers?
Yeah, so I guess my two love places on it is that I see kind of open source as kind of applicable to everything that can happen in Cardano in some context, whether it's e-commerce, the developer ecosystem, pretty much everything. And the things I'm thinking of is as a whole, if it's open source, is a net benefit. It's like a public good to society and the wider kind of thing. If there was a preference between closed source and open source, I think it would be fairly unanimously on the kind of open source thing. So it seems like something we're always kind of striving towards. But when I think of the developer ecosystem, I see that's more like a segment of a market that is important within Cardano. And then you might have like dApps, which is general purpose, and you could have a challenge to do with e-commerce or environment. And these are kind of like market segments. I think this kind of, what would be great to see in the future, not necessarily now, is this kind of a way to having this open source plan. Like, I don't think people need to be open source from the get-go. And I think I fully agree with what Matthias was saying earlier, is that like some people aren't going to be comfortable with that. But if they have some like, these are my intentions, at this release, and they kind of make that plan to, this is what will be open source, this, you know, making that plan out and saying what the path is to that process, then that is kind of applicable to any single challenge that kind of ever exists. It's just kind of this adding that kind of value of like, I know the value of open source and I can see this is the kind of path that would make sense for this, and this is how I will contribute in that area. And I think the kind of benefit of that is then in those challenges, people, and you get some advantage to it. It's like, it's clearly kind of added. You have like an incentive to do it, because then your proposal will be ranked higher. You'll have more chance of getting funding. It could become quite an integral part of the kind of funding process. Like, what is your open source plan? Is it already open source? Like, what benefit? What are you doing to make sure the documentation is good? All those kind of different things. But it should never be like you have to do this in stage one. There's always, you know, like Block Frost is a really good example. Like, super valuable, and you know, when they get to there, and you know, if they make subsequent proposals, it'd be really good to see what their kind of thoughts now, and kind of making sure it's getting open source. Obviously, we're seeing that now, but that's the kind of thing I'd be looking for. Is that, yeah, I'm absolutely fine with being closed source at the beginning, but then what are your thoughts between how are you going to approach getting there? So I think in the short term it makes sense to have the open source ecosystem challenge probably, but like I think as from a structure standpoint, it might be, this could be a way, if it's a development type proposal, anything to do with coding and development, this is where we could kind of change the proposal process to kind of start to favor and highlight the proposals as part of the community advisor review process, proposals that do this really well, and kind of explain this is that kind of process we're going to look for. So that would be my kind of thoughts on it.
All right, thanks, George. So it does seem like there's some details, but I think there's also a lot of agreement on sort of how this all works, and that, you know, everybody agrees open source is not easy, closed source is not necessarily all bad, and we want to encourage, just in general, just to move forward that helps us all the best. And for me, I think also one of the most important things is like, let's get a big challenge back in where there's space for all kinds of these projects. And that kind of brings me also to another thing, is that there's, of course, what we as a group think is the right budget balance, but we can't decide, right? And there's also a little bit of strategy to this. If we make a really big one for 2 million, it could get, if it doesn't end up very high, then it might not get filled. So there was also the idea to make, even just specifically for open source, similar to the dApps and integrations and the mini dApps and integrations, to have a double, like one that tries to go big and one that is just a much smaller budget and focuses maybe also on smaller efforts, or is just the same, but it's just split to give the voters a chance. Do you want 1.6, or do you want 400,000, or do you want both? So I set a little bit of a voting up with that idea. It doesn't fully include also this idea of maybe also having a separate open source development. I don't want to exclude that option. So I do think that's also an option. But I set this up to try and get some input from the group. We can do a bit of voting on a Miro board if people are up for that. I'll share the link again for anybody who got in later.
Do you also want to share your screen for the recording so that people who are not here can see the Miro board? Thank you.
Let me see. Let's see where we have this. This window. All right, I hope that's working.
Yep, thank you.
So I'll give people time to join in on the Miro board. You can follow the link. And then, so in the main overview frame, you can see the main questions. So I added some stickies. For anybody who is new to this, the idea is that I'm going to turn on some voting. I'll give everybody 3 votes, so you can sort of spread your thoughts. And we'll do it per item. So starting with total budget. So if you have a preference very strongly for one, or you're in a general area, you can spread it out a bit. So the idea of the first question is considering the total budget of challenges for Fund 8, what kind of indicative percentage should be going towards, in general, developer ecosystem, the open source, the smaller one, just all together? What are we thinking about? So this is just to see where the room is at. So let me see if I can get this.
Was the
to
total
work.
available fund 12.8 million, something along those?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll start now the first voting. And you can click on the stickies to the plus signs that you should be seeing. And there's first a pop-up, I think. And then you can distribute your 3 votes among those 5 stickies. And,
I'm totally influenced by your voting, by the way.
oh yeah, you can see what I'm voting. Oh, that's not. Oh, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, we could restart the voting.
Yeah, but you already know it's not like I'll change it just to just to play the game. But next time I'll wait a bit, give people a chance to do that uninfluenced. And you can also, and then you all saw a little bit my hesitation. All right. Well, I guess yeah. Now I'm not sure if it was too influenced, but we'll just take it for what it is. I think you can all you're all also have a strong opinion. So all right. Well, that's pretty clear on the around the 20% area. So we'll just move on to the next one. Oh, wait, then we lose the last one, so I'll record them this time. Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if everybody needs a full minute. Well, I guess could have just been 1 vote for 2 options. That's all right. All right. Bit heavy on the 2, but also some ideas for 1.
Sophie, may I ask you if you can add also 2 options there, the 40-60 and the 50-50?
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
And also which direction?
We'll discover it later. But that's a good point,
Then we
actually.
also
Yeah.
3. I'll just record.
You can add four more options, like 60, 40, 70, 30.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we did not yet define the challenges, which I mean, one should be closed, the other should be open. Just choose a order.
Yeah, originally when I set this up, I was more thinking of a distribution between the two open source challenges that are now in, where one could be smaller than the other, also to increase the odds of one making it in eventually. But maybe, yeah, that's complicating things now. So now we're voting on different interpretations. So I'm still interested to see. Oh.
Do you know if there is a way to join voting when you miss the pop-up? Because it disappeared and it happened to me in the first one, and now I can.
My interface has become very minimalistic, as you can see, so I can't add, I think.
Okay, because when you switch windows and click on, you don't click on the pop-up for join voting or not, it disappears. I cannot find it. Okay, I found it just in the last second, but it was at the
It was
bottom
too late.
left.
What would you have voted? I mean, you can add by voice if you want to, just to get an idea.
2080.
All right, we'll add the results. So I guess we could maybe do a bit of a round of if people want to give some argumentation for their choices. Maybe it would be interesting to hear from the people who preferred one, the 6 votes that went there.
I don't mind starting. I find it hard to have much of any kind of deep opinion here. It's really, if anything, I'm spraying and praying. It's like I can't be opinionating on it because I think there's a few things at play here. For instance, on the 1 or 2 challenges, there is some like applicable game theory to what happens when you have a larger challenge and what people are happy to request fund-wise. There's there's 2 challenges and there's small amounts, you're incentivized to have only kind of charge, try and get around 10-20%, reduce your project size. There's these kind of attributes that affect sizing, which I wouldn't say say whether one's better or worse. If you look at the data, 10 to 20% of the fund size is to request, seems to be a good kind of maximum generally, and that's a factor for this. The total proportion budget, yeah, this is then, and that comes straight into it, I guess, as well. So I think that's the first thing I want to think about a bit more, and then obviously my previous concerns about like, yeah, they kind of make sense as together. They can make sense because there's a lot of overlap. When it's open source tools, it's generally, it could be like an 80-90% overlap kind of thing. So without the kind of pure definitions, it's hard to kind of really vote on things of any kind of oomph from at least my perspective.
Yeah, that does make sense. It is tricky too. It does all tie in together. If we pick on this, then yeah, maybe that should be smaller or bigger, or if we split it between the two. There's a lot of conditionals that make it difficult to just give concrete answers. Anyone else want to share some thoughts on their voting or the choices they had to make? think in general, it's definitely just some input for now to consider for making these proposals. I don't know also how long people have the time to continue, but we've been in here for an hour, so just in case I want to add that I'm happy to add anyone who wants to be part of the current open source development ecosystem proposal. Also can consider that we just all co-propose on all of them, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, and sort of make it clear that it's a collaborative effort. So I wanted to just put that thought out there, and maybe also see if we can decide on at least a way for the next week how we're gonna communicate and align and make the finalizations on these 1, 2, or 3 proposals.
What might be a beneficial exercise in the future to do, or at some point, is to take, when you have these challenges, to kind of create some examples of the types of proposals that could go and list them out and think about the SDK, like whether it's this SDK, something like this, to try and then, and in this example, you're just going to look at what things would go in here that wouldn't go in here, and what's the context of why. So we had that kind of chat about, oh, if it's closed source first, maybe it goes in that one. But having those kind of list of ideas, I think would really bring to the forefront of it being like obvious. There's so much overlap here that it's kind of like we're just losing. You're just kind of separating for no reason. Or is like actually we find something. Oh, there's actually these are the certain use cases, and you can kind of hone the challenge in some way. So I think that would be the way I'd analyze this. Is just try to just throw more stuff at the wall and make more thorough kind of analysis on what could actually go in these. What is the real differences?
You're muted again, Matthias, I think. All right, so I'm not sure if everybody who added themselves to the board wants to be on as a co-proposer. Yeah, I don't want to add people who don't want to, but I'm happy to add any. Yeah, that's good. I see people adding now on the right. Yeah, if you want to join on the proposal, you can put it in the create proposal part, your name, and then I know that's.
I see.
And if you want to say like or add yourself to some other parts and make it clear how you are thinking about helping out to others, feel free.
Yeah, sorry about that. I hope this mic works.
Yes.
Is it audible? Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. The other mic just died. Yeah, I also want to invite everyone, anyone who wants to collaborate on the developer ecosystem challenge. Yeah, reach out to me and I'll add you immediately, because I unfortunately will not be able to make any progress really on any of the proposals until after this week, unfortunately. So I need some help on that front too.
I would be interested in actually I don't have much time, but I would be interested in really putting my nose into, because only now I realize how much they are tied together. And by the way, my vote, one of my votes was like 60%, 40%, 70%, 30%. But after your words, it was 70% in favor of non-open source, because actually I was thinking how much percentage of a budget a company should put into open source, and in my mind should be like 30%, not really much more. If I have a company, think about this. If I have a company, I write software, how much of my budget should I spend in open sourcing my work? If I have 10 people, how many people should I pay to make my content available for everybody? Yeah.
Well, it depends.
Yeah.
That kind of backs it. The importance of it being almost like an attribute of projects is like how open source it is. It's not necessarily like because open source can apply to everything. So I think that's one of the things. The thing that I'm scared of, and this is from Fund 7, and I wasn't particularly pleased with the ones that got voted the most on and the amount of participation involved with Fund 7. I am very scared that the developer ecosystem and these kind of ones don't get at least around 2 mil for the next one. I think it'd be a disservice to the potential of those kind of areas in terms of how much needs to be done and what the allocation. So as long as whoever's, I think there's at least 2 or 3 proposals, one of them's withdrawn, as long as there's enough collaboration between the ones who've made it, and yeah, there's a good chance we get most of that through the best we can. That's what I really want to help with. I don't really have any capacity to help with the challenge team stuff, but any way I can help with, try to make sure it gets across the line, voted in. I think that's just the key thing, because the distribution of whether it's 1 challenge or 2 challenge and what's included in each one is an issue, but it's marginal in terms of the comparison. If we don't get these voted in, that's the biggest kind of fear factor for me.
So maybe that's basically you're pushing in the direction of asking a little bit less, say 15% instead of 20, to increase the possibility of success.
Not necessarily. I think it'd be a comparison between the other proposals as well and where it sits, I guess, in some ways. You just analyze it like anything, but yeah, you just aim for like that kind of 2 mil, kind of as close to as possible that makes sense, just because there's so many things that can be done. And like you can see in the challenge now, the 200,000, it's a shit show in terms of how many good projects there are and how few of them are going to be funded. And it's just like that's 3 months down, kick down, down the road. It's just it's a hard thing to see.
One thing on that note, though, right? I mean, that was an assumption that I made, right? But for example, the dApps and integration challenge, it has been severely underfunded since forever, right? But again, Fund 6 had 105 proposals that made it through. And granted, just based on geography, scope, and whatnot, some of these proposals are probably funded. I know for Win-Win, which was the only proposal that got a 5-star rating among all the CAs, got voted in top. 25K is not enough to go from start to finish. I spend most of my time right now, besides doing company stuff, and damn, James is back, so he knows what I'm about to say. Unfortunately, I don't spend a lot of time coding, whether that be for Win-Win or PPBL these days. Right? What I'm trying to find out, how do I get more money? How can I pay my people? And still, people develop, even though this challenge is underfunded, people deliver. But I'm just worried, like, what is happening with the open source developer ecosystem challenge? Why are there only like 3 dozen proposals in there, right? So maybe there's also an opportunity to go to Idea Fest, or I guess Challenge Fest already passed anyway, but I guess more Challenge Fest and the proposals that are in the open source developer ecosystem challenge really promote well in Idea Fest, so that you push the idea of, well, this is all open source. This is kind of part of the ethos. We are welcoming, we are actively inviting people to contribute. And this is just a logical continuation of that. So I think maybe we have to do some evangelism, some advocacy for open source, period.
Yeah, agreed.
I didn't leave. I was just stuffing my face for a second before running to the next thing. Matthias and Sophie, thanks for running this thing. And we'll catch up real soon. I gotta jump to the next. George, I'm looking forward to Atala PBL.
Tomorrow, another meeting.
But it's closed source. You're not allowed to talk about Atala.
Oh, the whole reason we're
stuff,
building
though.
Password Chaos is to be the open source alternative to
Got it.
Prism. So more to come.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, we'll talk.
Thanks for participating.
See you, James.
Yeah, and also, considering the time and everything we discussed, I think I'm we can sort of call it for like the official part of this session. If people want to continue talking about it or sharing ideas, feel free. I'll stop the screen share as well.
This is the second room I'm joining, and people are leaving. If we go now.
Well, I'm not saying we're stopping, but maybe the recorded part or the official sort of like focus part
Oh, that's all right.
is ended here.
All right,
If
I'll
people
stop
want
the
to continue
recording.
to socialize,